We're gonna put all of this stuff onto that van to take it from this to this. So let's get started. Before we get started under the van, we need to take a measurement of our current ride height. On our driver rear, we're at 31 1/8, and our passenger rear, we're at 31 3/8. So that makes sense because our fuel tank is on this side of the van, only a 1/4 inch of difference, so not a huge deal. We're gonna check back after we install the rear to see actually how much lift we ended up with. We're gonna start on the rear of the van, so we need to jack it up so that the suspension can hang free. Now, if you had a hitch, it'd be a great spot to jack up from, but since I don't have one, I'm gonna use 2 floor jacks and jack from where the hitch would attach on the frame under the van. And then we'll put our jack stands in place. Now that the tires are up off of the ground on our jacks, the back of the van is actually like nearly 2 feet off the ground, way too tall for my jack stands. So I'm going to take the tires and wheels off, then we're going to lower the van onto the jack stands with a couple of spacers so the van is not supported only by the jacks while I'm going to be working under it. Now, since we're only supported by the jacks, it's pretty important to stay out from underneath the van at this point. With the wheels and tires off, it's time to start unbolting things. Now you're looking at this from the back of the van, and here is the rear shock. We need to undo the rear shock bolt, which is right here. Put a 18mm wrench on this side, 15mm socket on this side. With the shock disconnected, we're still looking at it from the same angle here. We're going to disconnect the axle housing from the leaf springs by unbolting the U-bolts that come up from the axle housing over the top of these leaf springs using a 21mm socket on these 2 bolts up here, and same on the back. We've removed the U-bolts and lowered the axle housing with the jack that came with the Transit, made it nice and controlled to lower. And now it's time to move the new leaf pack into place. And to prepare for that, we need to clamp these 2 together so they don't move whenever we remove this nut with a 15mm socket. With the center pin from the pre-existing leaf springs removed, it's time to get the Van Compass leaf pack prepared to put on the springs. And to do that, we just need to remove this nut and remove these 2 bolts. And the Van Compass leaf pack is simply going to go in between the axle housing and the factory leaf springs. I had to lower the axle all the way to the ground, so I just picked it up and put a piece of wood under it and then moved the jack out of the way from under the axle. I had to do that because there wasn't enough clearance between the top of the axle and the factory leaf springs to get this into place. But once we did that, I grabbed Steph and she came down and helped me put the hardware back in as I lifted up the leaf springs. She put these into place so it kind of holds everything together. And then we've also got these clamps and some other clamps that we're going to use to preload this spring so it's all squished together and rotate everything so it's nice and lined up. And then we'll be able to tighten our center pin and the hardware on the ends. Now our new leaf pack has been secured to the factory leaf springs, front, back, and in the middle. Next, I need to lift the axle housing back up so that this pin goes into the hole in the top of the axle housing, and then I can drop the new U-bolts that came with the leaf pack into the same holes that we took the old U-bolts out of. The leaf pack is completely installed, and the next step, if you were only doing a leaf pack, which I don't really know why you would be to put the wheel back on. But we are going to continue on and putting on a new shock. But the shock mounts on these Ford Transits, these guys right down here, actually hang down lower than the very center of the axle housing, the differential housing. and that kind of sucks for ground clearance. So Van Compass has this bracket that just fits in here, and it only goes in there one way. You'll kind of see how it goes. And if we put that in there, and then we actually cut off the bottom part of this bracket so that we have more ground clearance. So to do that, I do need to get this shock out of the way, which is good because it's going in the trash anyhow. So this just goes in there literally one way. If you put it in wrong, the holes don't line up. So just bloop like that. Gonna put that in there like that. Then we're gonna mark our cut lines. So with the bottom of the shock mount cut off, sanded down, and painted, so it's not going to rust, we can just put the bracket in place. Just put it here like this, put a washer onto our big bolt, put the bolt in just about 1/8 of an inch, put this spacer thing on the bolt inside of the bracket, and push the bolt through, and put a washer and nut on the other side. And then we have this other smaller bolt. We're going to put the bolt and the washer through the back, and then the washer and the nut on the other side. And now we can tighten all this up. Now that the high clearance shock mount is all finished up, it's time to move on to the shocks. And we're going to be installing these super fancy and high performance shocks that have adjustments. And I'm going to do my best to explain what the actual adjustments do. And although I'm going to do my best, Van Compass has a really good video that shows some illustrations of what happens on the inside of the shock whenever you make these adjustments. The first adjustment is the actual overall shock tuning. So we've got soft and performance. And you change these by simply rotating this shaft and 360 degrees in whichever direction that you're looking for. Performance is going to be for heavier vans, and soft is going to be for lighter vans, basically. It also has a cold function, which is in soft because the oil that's inside of here is not going to flow as quickly during cold weather. So if you're in cold weather like we are, might be something you can change, right before winter when you're changing into snow tires. And to change it, you would simply unbolt the bottom part and then rotate that 360 degrees, bolt it back up, you're good to go. The other setting is this dial right up here. So regardless of which one you set this one at, you have these two settings times all of these settings on here. So you've got 1, 2, and 3. Setting number 1 is going to be the softest setting out of all of these up here. And that's going to be for off-road, forest roads, anything where you're going long distances on pretty rough roads at slower speeds. Shock setting number 3 here, it's going to be for like highway settings, highway, high wind. So basically I-80 across Wyoming, when you have like strong crosswinds, this is going to lock up the shock to its hardest setting, so you're not going to get that sway back and forth. Now shock setting number 2 is going to be the middle setting, which is going to be for like everyday driving. And then even in 2, you have these tiny micro adjustments that you can adjust to just feel however you want to be driving. So there's all kinds of different adjustments here that ultimately I'm probably going to keep it pretty much right in the middle, 2, and then like 4 or 5 on here. And then I'm going to play with it over time to see how it goes. When we get on the interstate, probably just going to bump it up to 3. When we head up Buff Pass just outside of town, going to dial it back down to 1. So we're going to get these installed. Bolts here, bolts here. These are labeled on which side they go on, so pay attention to that and should be good to go. Putting this shock in and ran into a little issue here with this piece of hardware from our leaf pack. The threads on this side of the bolt, they're just real close to the shock, and I think as the suspension moves up and down, it's just going to get too close to this reservoir here that too close for my comfort. So I'm going to take this and swap that around. I'll leave a note, on the video back when we did this to do that from the start, but that'll be a quick little fix. And the shock is now installed and we are good to go there. We're set on setting number 2 for just right in the middle for now. Now the next thing to do is to replace or to add a spacer to the bump stop. Now I've already pulled the bump stop off and it was just a matter of going like this and it came off. So we're going to take this bolt off, put our spacer in, put our bolt back in, and then put our bump stop back on. And with the bump stop installed, that wraps up this side of the suspension upgrade here on the driver rear of the van. Now, a lot of you may be wondering why I didn't put the shock boot onto the shock. And that's because it weighs like 500 grams. And that's, you know, people are just always griping at me in the comment section below about how much things weigh. So I thought by omitting that, that would be the best way I could possibly think of to decrease the weight of this van. And with all the suspension upgrades done on this side, I've actually already done it on the other side as well. We're not going to show that on camera because the process is the exact same. So if you needed to know how to do it on the other side, just back up in this video and it's the same process. And with everything wrapped up on the back of the van, we're going to move our jacks underneath our axle so we can get our axle housing up a little higher. And then we're going to put our new wheels and bigger tires onto here and then move to the front of the van. With the back of the van all finished up, we moved to the front of the van, jacked the front of the van up, slid our jack stands in place, removed the wheel and tire, and then lowered the jack to where the van is sitting on the jack stands and not the jack. And now we're ready to start disassembling everything up front. And there's a lot of parts to disassemble, but we're just going to take it in a step-by-step process, just like is shown in the instruction manual, and so it's kind of manageable. And we're going to start with the tie rod end right over here. So we're taking this off, I'm going to flip it upside down and thread it on a few times so we can knock our tie rod free. Move this out of the way, and then we can just put this back on for safekeeping so we don't lose it. With the tie rod disconnected, we can move this over here so we can access the 2 bolts that are on the back side of the brake caliper. They're pretty hard to see, but it's pretty obvious where the caliper attaches to the steering knuckle. There's 2 big 21 mil bolts. And with the brake caliper off, we're just going to zip tie it up and out of the way so it's not hanging by the brake hose. Next up is the sway bar in link right here. Just loosen this. We may have to lift this whole assembly up just a little bit and knock this free. Next, we need to disconnect both of these wires from the strut support right over here. And it's one going to the brake. There's a little lever. If you follow this all the way up, it's impossible to see. You have to go by feel, and it's at the top of the connection. Just pull it toward you, and then that connection just pops right out, just like so. This one here is, we're going to have to undo this here. And it's just a trim clip, so you're realistically just pushing in all of these sides until this whole thing comes free right here. And a trim pry tool on the back side actually worked really good for that. With all of the sensors disconnected from the strut, it's time to remove the axle nut right here on the front. And this is a huge nut, 36 millimeters. And the tricky part about this is when you spin this, the whole axle or the whole hub moves here. And so you need a way to hold the hub in place so it doesn't spin. And so I've got a piece of unistrut just laying around. that I'm going to put in between the wheel studs here. And then we can put that on here, and then it's going to capture the hub so it doesn't move. Success. And with this nut free, we just need to make sure the CV shaft can go back up in there like that. And if it can't, if it's kind of stuck a little bit, you can just put this back on there, get a few threads on there, and then whack it with a hammer. But we don't need to do that, fortunately. Next up is going to be removing this bolt right back here. That is connecting the steering knuckle here to the bottom of the strut. Next is the lower ball joint nut right down here. Just loosen that up, 30mm socket. And that's all we're doing for now, because I'm going to put a jack under here to help us get this steering knuckle out of this lower control arm. And now that we have a fair amount of pressure lifting up this lower control arm with all of that weight on that nut on the lower ball joint right there, we're going to whack this with a hammer, and I hope this comes free. That's the plan, so hammer. Hey, it came loose. Oh my gosh. Now, since that did come loose with just whacking on it with a hammer, that's great. That's actually fantastic. I must be doing something right in life for that to happen. If that doesn't happen, you can use a pickle fork. That is an option, but there's a possibility of damaging the boot there. The other option is to use fire. If you heat up this lower section of the control arm, that's going to expand that metal just a little bit. Heat it up for a minute, 2 minutes or so, and then whack on it with a hammer, and then it should come loose. So those are really the resources you get, and just be persistent with it. You know, sometimes it's just a pain in the butt. The next step is going to actually be removing this whole steering knuckle and everything right in here, and a lot of things are going to sort of happen at one time. We're going to take a breaker bar and put it in this little hole in the lower control arm and pry the lower control arm so it gets down and out of the way, and then we can pull the lower ball joint up and out of the lower control arm. When we do that, we'll pull this out a little bit, and then the steering knuckle will come down off of this strut right here. So lots of stuff happening at one point. And now that's back here, we need to wrestle the CV axle or the CV shaft out of here. We're going to support all this with a jack, because that's the only thing that's holding this from falling on my foot at the moment. So the CV shaft just came out of the back of the steering knuckle there, and we don't want this to come apart, so we're actually just going to secure it to the lower control arm. Zip tie or voile strap or whatever you've got going on in your own shop. Just like that. Now we can drop this entire assembly off of the strut. Now the strut assembly needs to come out. And the top of the strut assembly is actually up underneath the dash. There are 3 bolts that are holding this strut assembly to the van itself. And I cheated. I've actually already done this on the other side, and they were very difficult to get to. On the driver's side here, they seem like they're better, but if they're not, we have this little right angle impact driver adapter bit thing. It's got flexi neck on it, and then also a series of U-joints. And so realistically, there's just 3 bolts holding this. They're just in a very awkward and terrible spot. Let's go see if we can even see them. The spot we need to get to is actually underneath the floor liner, effectively right behind this cup holder, and it is impossible to see. So we're just going to pop up an illustration of where it should be, but if you just go where this cup holder is, pull this floor liner back, and then feel up and around right there, that's where it is. There are 3 bolts on top of studs in a kind of triangular pattern. Whenever I get to pull this out, you'll get to see what it looks like, but I'm gonna start with a wrench and see what I can do. Well, you get down your fiddle and you get down your bow, kick off shoes and you throw 'em on the floor. Success. Now I have one more nut to go on the top of this strut inside. But as soon as I undo that, this whole thing is going to fall down. Steph is over at her warehouse at the moment, so she can't help me. So I'm just going to put this piece of wood right here on top of this CV shaft and give it ever so much pressure up just to hold this up in place so that it doesn't just come crashing down whenever I undo that last bolt. That's secure. I'm gonna go back inside, undo it for real. And we got it, back under. With the strut out of the van, we are just needing to remove this coil to replace it with the new coil from Van Compass. So we've got these coil compressors that we're just going to put on here to compress, and then we can remove this cap here on the top. Now, this can be pretty dangerous because these coils carry a lot of energy inside of them. So we're just going to go slow, one side at a time, back and forth until this is compressed. We can loosen this, take it off, and then loosen our coil. And now we have some movement of the coil on the strut, and so now we can just remove the bolt on the end of the strut here to pull this out of the way. And then we can pull this piece out of the way. And now we can loosen our compressors here so the coil can return to its normal state. And here is our new coil that's going to go on in the same way that we just took the old coil off. And once this is compressed quite a bit, we can start reassembling the top of the strut here. We can put this piece into place and it'll just click into the top of the coil here, nice and tight like that. And the bottom of the coil here just needs to fit in this little groove that's on top of this part of the strut. Once we have that, we can start being able to see if the cap on the top is going to fit through. And it looks like we still need to compress a little bit so that we can get this nut into there. So we'll just keep going. Now we've got the strut cap on the top of it and the bolt in place, and now we need to tighten the bolt, but it's kind of weird, and let's talk about why. So if I were just to put a socket on here and tighten this up, this whole assembly is going to spin, and so we have to be able to hold the inside of that with an Allen key like that. See, this whole thing is going to spin. But since this is recessed and down in here, it's pretty much impossible to get a wrench in there with any kind of good bite. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to put this socket over, bite down on it with some vice grips, stick our Allen key inside and get it into the thread, and then we can tighten this up. And this does need to be torqued to 41 foot-pounds, and realistically, I have no way to get an actual torque on this, so 41 pounds isn't a lot, so we're just going to do our best. That should be good. And with this torqued down, we can loosen our coils. With all of this assembled, we actually need to use an angle grinder to cut these studs down just a little bit, because the spacer that is going on top of the strut here, these studs are just too long and they would interfere with the top of the strut where we installed this, pulled this out of the van, remember, from underneath the dash. So we just have to cut these down to 16 millimeters so that they don't interfere. And now we can put this spacer back onto the top of the strut, just like so. You can see that now these are cut down so they're not going to be sticking up past the top of this spacer. Now on this spacer, it is important to notice the L on this one. So there's an L and an R spacer. L is for the driver's side and right is for the passenger side. So that's really important. These are directional as far as which one needs to be on which side, so don't miss that. The arrow on the front of these needs to be facing towards the front of the van. So once we get all this installed, it's important to pay attention to where the arrow is facing once we reinstall this. Now this whole thing can rotate once it's already bolted together, so you'll just have to grab on and twist as appropriate. Now we can put this on, put our washers and nuts on top of these studs and torque them to 30 foot-pounds. Now the instructions say to go ahead and put this back into the van at this point and then put the steering knuckle on this. But like I hinted at earlier, I've already done the other side, so I'm picking up some tips and tricks, and it was a pain in the butt doing it like that. So I'm going to get the steering knuckle and we're going to put it onto the strut here on the tabletop and then lift everything up into place. I watched another YouTube video where the guy did it like that and it seemed easier. Maybe, we're gonna see. I'm gonna do it like that and let you know which way was better. Put some anti-seize down in here. And then we can put the steering knuckle back onto the strut. And it's on there. That was pretty easy, but the trick will be getting this whole assembly into the van. And this only goes in there one way. This spline needs to go into this crack in the back of the steering knuckle. And also the bottom of the strut needs to be bottomed out on this lip right here of the steering knuckle. Now we're gonna put this bolt back into our steering knuckle right here with a bit of blue Loctite. And we're gonna torque it down to 76 foot-pounds and then an additional half a turn. And now all of this is reassembled and we can take this and move it back under the van. Steph's here because she works here. Okay, now. So we're about to move this into the van. So I've got Steph here on standby to operate the jack and help me hold this if necessary. But the super important part to know about this part is the hub is facing with the studs out like it's actually installed. And then remember our little engraving on the top here. That arrow needs to be facing forward. And so we just rotate it to where it's facing forward. That way all this is going the right direction when we put this into the top of the van. So let's see if we can get this thing in there. And it's in there. I'm gonna go inside and see if I can start some of those bolts just one at a time, and we'll kind of move this and wrestle it into place until we have all three of those bolts on inside the van. So I have one nut on the top of the stud in there, so it's holding tight from the top, but I can still kind of wiggle it around. Now is going to be a good time to go ahead and put our CV shaft into the back of the steering knuckle. And our CV shaft is in there. It's not fully in there, but it'll be better once we get this moved up a little further, put the jack back under, and continue wrestling this up into place until we have all three of our bolts on the studs up top. Now that the steering knuckle and the strut is secured to the top of the van, it can just hang there from those top bolts. And so we can go ahead and just lower the jack and get it out of the way, because the next thing we need to do is reverse of what we did earlier and pry this lower control arm down with our breaker bar here and put the lower control arm onto our lower ball joint stud down here put the nut on, and then torque it down to like 180 foot-pounds. My torque wrench only goes to 150 foot-pounds, so we're just going to do our best there. So there's 150, and then a little more for good measure. Now we're moving up here to the top of the sway bar in link and the part where it attaches to the strut right here. Now, since we put that spacer in here, this is too low to attach to this. And so Van Compass has this relocation kit that simply bolts in place. Now there's two of these. There's one for the driver's side, one for the passenger side, and they only go on in one direction, but they're not marked. So realistically, can't mess this up. This bent flange on the bottom goes underneath, and this bent flange on the side goes to the side of this. Plop that in place. Get our bolt that came with the relocation kit, put it in the back. Put our washer in place. And then the bolt. And then tighten this to 76 foot-pounds. Next, I need to connect this sway bar in link to the sway bar relocation bracket. Take this off where I put it for safekeeping earlier. And then it's still a little too low, so I've got the jack underneath the bottom of the steering knuckle, so I can just simply jack that up and into place. And then before we put the sway bar in link into the bracket, we have to put this spacer washer from the Van Compass kit onto that, and then we can thread this through like so, and then put on our nut and then tighten it with an Allen key and a wrench. 76 foot-pounds there. Next up is all of the sensor wires that we disconnected right over in here. For the wheel speed sensor, this little guy here goes on the back of the strut. There's a little clip back there, and it simply pops into place there. Then wheel speed sensor connection here. Push until it clicks, and then push the little red piece down to lock it in place and secure it where you found it initially. And then the wire going to the brake caliper connects in the same fashion you disconnected it. And this is kind of tight, so I'm going to put the brake caliper on before putting this back into this bracket right over here. Next is putting the brake caliper back onto the brake here. So we're going to take our bolts out of the brake caliper that we put here for safekeeping, put a bit of Loctite on them, and then tighten them in the exact same way they came off. And then they have to be tightened down to like 203 foot-pounds. Another 50. And then this wire going to the brake caliper, just put this inside of the bracket over here where we found it initially, just like that. And now we can do our tie rod back on the steering knuckle. So rotate that around, take our nut off where we saved it for safekeeping earlier. Rotate the steering knuckle back around and then thread that up and through. A bit of Loctite. Thread it on and then torque it down to 59 foot-pounds. And lastly is the axle nut right here, torqued to 250 foot-pounds. There's 150, and then I just pull as hard as I can. Oh. Okay. And this is all assembled. And before we put the wheel and tire back on, jack everything up, get the jack stands out of the way. It's very, very important to know that we're not done. This needs an alignment. You can't put on a lift kit and not get an alignment. So we're not going to show that on video because, well, we don't have a way to do an alignment in our shop. It's usually something best left to professionals. Just take it to an alignment shop, tire shop, local mechanic. Any of them will be able to do it. Just be sure to call ahead because the transits are pretty tall and not every shop is capable of working on such a tall vehicle. So we're going to get an alignment after this is all wrapped up. But now let's jack this up, get it off the jack stands, and get the new tires and wheels put on. So the tires that came on the van were these guys at 235, 65 R16. So they're a fair amount smaller, 2 inches in diameter or so, and obviously much worse looking than the new guys. So these tires are Falcon Wild Peak ATs, and they are in the size of 245, 75, 16. Now with these, we actually didn't have to trim anything. You can go with a little bit bigger tire on here, but then you have to start doing some trimming of the bumper, trimming of the pinch welds, and the instructions for the Van Compass lift kit. It's got that information right here in the instructions. And the trimming is realistically going to happen once you get up to a 265, 75, 16, which is a little bit bigger than this, a little bit wider, a little bit taller. Now these are load range E tires, so they are very beefy for this heavy van, and you have to be careful not to get, your tires not rated for the weight that it's going to be carrying. The other thing about this is we got this wheel and tire combo. These are Method wheels. We got this whole combo from Tire Rack, and we got them mounted, balanced, and shipped to our door all like they are with lug nuts, just right from their website. We live in a small town in northwest Colorado. Getting wheels and tires mounted is sometimes a lengthy process. So it was nice to just get this stuff shipped right to our door and we could just put it on without having to go to a tire shop to get that done for us. So super happy with how it looks, but as far as the actual lift goes, we took measurements before and after, and I've already kind of went around and checked. And front's sitting right at 34 inches to the bottom of the wheel arch right there. And that's like 4 inches of lift. So 2 inches is coming from the lift kit itself, about 2.5. And then the remainder of that is coming from the bigger tires, which is actually giving us the added ground clearance. So we are super happy with how this looks. We're gonna pull it out into the sun and see how it looks. And while you're checking out how beautiful that looks, here are some tips for success. I mentioned the steering knuckle and installing it back on the strut either first or second, once it's in the van versus on the tabletop. I don't think either way was easier than the other. And so maybe following the instructions is probably just the best answer there. The next thing is get an alignment. Getting an alignment is going to make sure that everything works properly and you're not just eating through your tires because they're rubbing on the pavement unnecessarily. The next thing is making sure that the strut spacers are facing the right direction. Remember that there is a left and a right for the driver and passenger side, with the arrows needing to be facing the front of the van. All that is found pretty clearly in the instruction manual. It's also very important to have all of your tools at the ready from the instruction manual. The instruction manual does a really good job of laying out what parts and tools specifically you're going to need. So go through, take inventory of the tools you need and then the tools that you already have. That way when you're mid-project, you're not having to make unnecessary runs to the hardware store. Now, is this a DIY-friendly project? Yes, it is, but it is challenging. If you're a shade tree mechanic, can operate all of these tools, have a friend that could help you, all of that kind of stuff, this is easily something that you can do. It is challenging, but it's no more challenging than any other lift kit that I've installed. Just follow the instructions, they're very good, take it step by step, have fun, take breaks when you get frustrated, and enjoy what you've made. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.